I remember the moment the judge said the word settled because my ex-husband squeezed his lawyer's arm and smiled like he'd just won the lottery. We were sitting across the room from each other, and when his eyes met mine, there was no warmth left in them, only satisfaction. That was the moment I knew he thought he'd taken everything that mattered from me, including the house I once believed was our safe place. Before all of this, my life was simple in a way I didn't fully appreciate at the time. I'd been married to Daniel for 11 years, and for most of that time, I thought we were a team. I worked as a project coordinator for an import-export firm, steady hours, decent pay, nothing glamorous, but reliable. Daniel worked in real estate, confident and charming, the kind of man who always believed the room belonged to him. We lived in a modest but beautiful house just outside the city. White walls, a small garden I took care of every Sunday morning. That house wasn't just bricks and paper to me. It was where I learned how to cook meals for two, where I painted the spare bedroom yellow because he said it made him feel calm, where I cried quietly in the bathroom when things between us started to feel wrong. The cracks didn't appear all at once. At first, it was little things I brushed off because I loved him and because I wanted to believe marriage meant weathering uncomfortable phases. He started coming home late, always with an explanation that sounded reasonable enough on its own. A client dinner, a networking event, a deal that needed his personal attention. He'd talk more and listen less, his phone always face down on the table, his laughter sharper, sometimes aimed at me in a way that stung. When I asked if something was wrong, he'd sigh and say I was overthinking, that work stress was getting to both of us, that we just needed time. Then came the money conversations. Daniel had always handled most of the financial planning, not because I couldn't, but because he insisted he was better at it. He'd say things like, "Trust me, this is my field," and I let him because it felt easier than arguing. Slowly, decisions were made without me. Accounts shifted. Conversations became lectures. When I pushed back, he'd remind me of how much he contributed, how the house was only possible because of his career. I started to feel like a guest in my own life, smiling through dinners and nodding through discussions that felt less and less like discussions at all. The night he asked for a divorce, there was no dramatic fight. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the same one where we'd once planned vacations and joked about future children we never had. He said it calmly, like he was discussing the weather. He told me we'd grown apart, that he needed something different, that this wasn't anyone's fault. I remember staring at a crack in the wood and thinking how strange it was that something so small could suddenly feel like the only solid thing in the room. I didn't cry in front of him. I just nodded and asked practical questions because shock does funny things to you. The divorce process dragged on longer than I expected. Lawyers, paperwork, meetings that felt more like business negotiations than a dismantling of a marriage. Daniel became colder, more strategic. He wanted the house, and he made that clear early on. His argument was simple and relentless. He earned more, he found the property, he managed the mortgage. To him, it was logical that the house should be his. To me, it felt like he was trying to erase the years I'd poured into making that place a home. By the time we reached the settlement hearing, I was exhausted, emotionally, physically, in every way that mattered. I wanted it to be over. When the final terms were read, the house went to Daniel. He leaned back in his chair like a man who just proved a point, and when the judge confirmed it, he didn't even try to hide his grin. I walked out of that room with a thin folder under my arm and the heavy feeling that I'd lost more than just a building. As I stepped into the hallway, I told myself that maybe peace was worth the price, even if it felt unfair. But deep down, something quiet and steady inside me knew this story wasn't finished yet. The days after the settlement were strangely quiet. I moved into a small rented apartment across town. Bare walls, mismatched furniture, boxes still half unpacked because I didn't have the energy to finish. Friends checked in, their voices soft and careful, asking how I was holding up. I told them I was fine because explaining the truth felt too heavy. At night, I lay awake replaying moments from the marriage. wondering where I'd lost my footing and how I'd let myself be pushed so far to the side of my own life. Daniel didn't wait long to enjoy his victory. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard he'd already started renovations on the house. New floors, modern fixtures, changes that erased every trace of me. Someone mentioned he'd thrown a small dinner party, proudly showing off his place as if it had always been his alone. Hearing that hurt more than I expected. It wasn't jealousy, it was the feeling of being rewritten out of my own history. What Daniel didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that years earlier, before our marriage began to crack, I'd made a decision quietly and without drama. My job had sent me overseas for a 6-month assignment, and during that time, I'd fallen in love with a small coastal city. It was nothing like where we lived. Slower, warmer, full of narrow streets and ocean air. I'd invested some savings, taken a risk I hadn't even fully explained to Daniel, and bought a modest property there in my name alone. It wasn't a secret born out of distrust. At the time, it felt like something just for me, a safety net, a dream I could hold on to in a life that often revolved around someone else's ambitions. During the divorce, my lawyer had asked about overseas assets. I told her the truth, calmly, and she'd raised her eyebrows, but nodded. Because the property was purchased with my personal funds and registered under foreign law, it wasn't part of the marital assets in the way Daniel assumed everything was. We discussed it carefully, strategically. There was no obligation to bring it into the settlement unless Daniel knew to ask, and he never did. He was too focused on the house he could see, the one he could point to and claim. As the weeks passed, something inside me shifted. The sadness didn't disappear, but it stopped being the loudest voice in my head. In its place came clarity. I started sleeping better. I finished unpacking. I took walks in the evening and noticed things again, like the way the light hit the pavement, or how my shoulders felt without constant tension. I wasn't plotting revenge in the dramatic sense. I didn't need to hurt him. I just needed to reclaim the part of myself I'd shrunk to keep the peace. The breaking point came unexpectedly, during a conversation I didn't even plan to have. Daniel called one evening, his tone casual, almost friendly, like we were distant colleagues rather than former spouses. He told me he was thinking of selling the house in a few years, upgrading, moving on. Then he laughed softly and said, "I guess it all worked out for me in the end." That laugh did something to me. It wasn't anger that rose up. It was resolve. I realized he truly believed he outplayed me, that he'd walked away with everything of value. That night, I opened my laptop and booked a flight. Not out of spite, but out of certainty. I was done being small. I was done letting someone else define what I had lost or gained. As the confirmation email landed in my inbox, I felt a calm I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't running away. I was stepping into something I'd built quietly, patiently, without needing anyone's permission. And I knew, sooner or later, Daniel would find out just how incomplete his victory really was. Standing on the balcony of my overseas home for the first time in months, I breathed in the sea air and felt something settle deep in my chest. The place was simple, sunlit, and entirely mine. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, opening the windows, reminding myself that this wasn't a fantasy or a consolation prize. It was real, solid, and earned. For the first time since the divorce, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what I still had and what I could build next. The revelation didn't come from me calling Daniel or sending a message meant to sting. Life has a way of revealing truths on its own schedule. A mutual friend visited me a few months later and posted a photo online. Nothing dramatic, just me smiling on a terrace with the ocean behind me. The caption mentioned my new place. I didn't think much of it until my phone started buzzing with messages asking questions. Where was I? How long had I been there? Was I moving? Daniel reached out not long after. His message was brief, almost clipped, asking what the photo was about. When I replied honestly, telling him I owned a home overseas and had for years, There was a long pause. Then came disbelief, followed by anger disguised as confusion. He accused me of hiding assets, of being dishonest, of manipulating the process. I listened calmly, reading his words without the familiar knot in my stomach. When I explained that everything had been legal, disclosed properly, and separate, his tone changed. The confidence was gone. In its place was the realization that his carefully crafted win wasn't as complete as he'd thought. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices in a courtroom or final showdown in person. The power shift was quieter than that. He understood, maybe for the first time, that I wasn't as dependent or as naive as he had assumed. The house he'd taken so proudly was just one chapter. I had another life waiting, one he hadn't controlled or claimed. When he suggested reopening discussions, I declined politely. There was nothing left to negotiate. In the months that followed, I made changes that had nothing to do with him. I adjusted my work to spend part of the year abroad. I built routines that felt like mine again. Morning walks by the water, evenings filled with books, and long dinners with people who listened as much as they spoke. Occasionally, I'd hear updates about Daniel through the same distant channels as before. The renovations cost more than he expected. The market shifted. The house didn't sell as quickly as he planned. I felt no satisfaction in that, only a quiet sense of balance. Looking back now, I see that the settlement wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I stopped fighting to keep something that no longer held me, and started valuing what I'd protected without even realizing it. Losing the house taught me that security isn't always visible, and winning doesn't always look like possession. Sometimes it looks like freedom. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and waiting for the right moment to be seen. I didn't take revenge by tearing Daniel down. I simply stepped into a life he never knew existed, and in doing so, I finally reclaimed myself.